There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between radio and bar talk, between commentary and recaps, and it lies between the pit of man's Netflix subscriptions and the summit of his binge-watching ability. This is the dimension of podcasting and the Twilight Zone. These are the Zone-i-Sodes. And now your hosts, Brandon Davis and Scott McFarland.
Hello, everyone out there in podcast land. Welcome to the Front Row Movie Reviews, the podcast for people who actually like movies and TV. And welcome to Zone-i-Sodes, our retrospective of every single episode of the Twilight Zone from the 1950s and 60s. We're here today to talk about Season 2, Episode 7, Nick of Time. I'm Scott McFarland, and with me, as always, is...
Brandon Davis.
And returning to us in the nick of time, we have the legend that is Robert Meyer Burnett. Sir, welcome back.
Oh, it's great to be back here. There's nothing I like more than talking about the Twilight Zone, except perhaps my hatred of Star Trek Discovery. Oh, wait a minute. How much I love Star Trek, the original series.
I actually am doing another podcast on Discovery every episode, and it's more of a hate watch now than anything else. I'd rather be doing a podcast on Orville, but I feel like I'm pot committed at this point.
I mean, I was doing on Collider. We were doing some reviews, and a lot of people hate me. It's really interesting to go from being a Star Trek expert to being the old man screaming, "Get off my lawn." But what I find really interesting is that, the Twilight Zone is a perfect example of something that the writing has maintained for almost 60 years now. And it's still relevant. In the episode we're going to talk about tonight, it still works. When you had people like Richard Matheson writing great stories. And what I find so interesting about Star Trek Discovery is it's one of the worst scripted science fiction television shows I think that's ever been on TV.
I loved your tweet when the premiere dropped. I think it was Star Trek Discovery is the Battlefield Earth of Star Trek.
Oh, and it's so interesting because to me it's just a show that it seems like the writers, I said one of the producers was like, yeah, we have all of us are in the writer's room. And I'm like, yeah, it shows, man. Some of you guys got to go away and write an episode about one thing. They've spent 9 episodes or 8 episodes talking about a propulsion system.
I keep waiting for Nick Meyer to show up. I'm hoping he does sometime. Because
he's gone. He's gone. No, he was purged.
But he had to be involved in some of the writing since the episodes were made before it even dropped. But I know.
Oh, I have his script that he wrote. He wrote episode 2. Of course, when Brian Fuller and his people were dismissed, all of that went away.
Yeah, when we got the... Oh, okay. Well, that's for a podcast for another day.
Yes.
I need to get you on that one, too, because we'll rant for a while, and Brandon, who doesn't watch the show, can just live without it.
Yeah.
Yes. So we're talking about Nick of Time, and we'll go ahead and I'll give the synopsis. Brandon, you'll give the Rod Serling intro. But I'm very happy to have you on, Robert, because obviously, out of the 3 of us here, you are the only person to actually direct William Shatner in a film. So I think you're going to have some info as well as everything else in this Twilight Zone. So I'm looking forward to that.
Absolutely.
So Don and Pat are newlyweds traveling to New York through Ohio. And when their fuel pump goes out, they're stuck in Ridgeview, Ohio for 4 hours waiting for the repair. They go into a diner to spend some time there and find a penny machine that tells your fortune. Initially, Don uses it as a joke, but soon finds that the answers are eerily connected to what they are dealing with in real life, including Don waiting for a promotion that finally comes through after the fortune teller tells him that it's about to happen. Don gets a little more obsessed, and especially after the fortune teller tells them not to leave before 3 o'clock p.m., and as they do leave at 3 o'clock, they are almost hit by a car when crossing the street. They return back to the fortune teller machine, but finally Pat gets Don to leave and they drive off up into the unknown as two other people walk in who are still trapped in Ridgeview, a slave to the fortune-telling machine.
And here's what Rod has to say. The hand belongs to Mr. Don S. Carter, male member of a honeymoon team en route across the Ohio countryside to New York City. In one moment, they will be subjected to a gift most humans never receive in a lifetime. For one penny, they will be able to look into the future. The time is now. The place is a little diner in Ridgeview, Ohio, and what this young couple doesn't realize is that this town happens to lie on the outskirts of the Twilight Zone.
So we'll talk about our first impressions first, and we'll go to Robert first. Tell us your experience with the watching Nick of Time, like the first time you saw it and what you remember of it.
Well, you know, when I watched as a kid, I mean, I've been watching Twilight Zone episodes for, 45 years now or something. And, you know, I came to Twilight Zone after I had started watching Star Trek. And Star Trek is my favorite thing in the world, even as a 5-year-old. And I remember seeing Nightmare at 20,000 Feet first before this episode. And I remember when Shatner was on it, I mean, this episode is 4 years. It's the second season, so it's 3 years before Nightmare at 20,000 Feet season 5. But this is season 2, so Shatner is looking young and virile, the most handsome he's ever looked. He's in top Shatner form at this point. And you know, he's just been married, and his character is very much in love. And I remember when I saw this, I expected something big was going to happen. And basically this episode is they walk into a diner, they sit at a booth, they eat a sandwich, they leave for a while, and they come back and sit at this booth again after these biddies leave. So in terms of action-packed episodes of television, this is not one of those. And it was really interesting because in this episode, and watching it again, I watch it for this podcast, I'm always struck as I watch these things how much of they still work. But in this particular episode, what was so interesting is the idea that somebody was so superstitious. You see in the episode that he has a keychain that has both a rabbit's foot and a 4-leaf clover on it. And the idea that somebody would be so superstitious that they would even for 1 second believe that this little fortune-telling, this devil-headed fortune-telling machine, this napkin holder fortune-telling machine would have any sway over a person at all. And in a way, I don't think that element of the episode works anymore. However, watching it again, the message that superstition and belief can be so powerful in a person's life is more true now, or as true as it ever was. I mean, our country is so divided, and you see whether you call it fake news or you call it, I mean, people are believing the flat earthers. I mean, the craziness people are spreading to one another via the internet. You realize that a person like William Shatner's character in this episode is not too far away from a lot of what's still going on our planet right now. So, yeah.
Brandon, how about you?
Yeah, just like Robert, my first Shatner experience was Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, and I came to this one pretty late. But, you know, Scott, I'm starting to be more like you. I think this is the ultimate Shatner Twilight Zone episode because
I've been telling you for a while that's the case.
Wait, well, the common denominator here is always the best Twilight Zone episodes are the simplest premise, just maybe 2 or 3 characters, the same set, and just a really, really good character-driven script. And this is one of those, and it's such a great example of how fear can cripple, and how, you know, whatever it is, you know, as Robert mentioned, you know, but beliefs or you know, just what we allow ourselves to be deceived by or allow ourselves to sort of be a victim to.
Yeah.
It's very telling, and it's very telling in the climate that we're living in now. And it'd been a while since I'd seen it, but fresh watching it this time, because when you look at where we're at now in our society, people would, buy magic beans on the street, I feel like. But
Right.
you can fall for anything, and you can let yourself be a slave to anything, and that's what this episode really does well.
Yeah. Go ahead, Robert.
Oh, well, one of the things that the fortune telling machine has become, you can buy it. You can buy, there's all different versions of it. You can get a full size one. You can get little toy versions of it. I had forgotten just how creepy. There's one shot. It's like it's just a straight on shot of the machine, but the way it's lit, it's the devil, the bouncing devil head is casting the shadow on the wall. And it's so great how in this episode that devil creature is a character. Because if it was if there was no devil head on it, I don't think it would have been nearly as effective. But the fact that it's got that cheesy diamond eye, that we used to get on things when we were little kids, and it's great the way, and it's always bobbling up and down. Sometimes it's bobbling maybe a little too much, but it's really great how they do that. So it is truly, there's other characters, that the diner, the proprietor, the cook in the diner, and who's apparently I love the fact that the food in the diner is terrible. The water's bad, and the sandwich is stale, and the guy behind's like, why don't you try the chicken fried steak? It's really good. And that sounds unappealing, because who eats chicken fried steak anymore? So you're like, you're already in hell. You're in this horrible small town, and this diner that should have, aren't country diners supposed to have the best food? And this diner has horrible food. So you're in this.
He warned them against getting the sandwiches. He said there, don't get the sandwiches. So he tried.
And it should be mentioned that this episode was written by Richard Matheson, who's one of the great, along with Charles Beaumont. Richard Matheson wrote classic Star Trek episodes, and he wrote incredible novels and stories, and he was so involved with a lot of the science fiction and horror of the 60s and the 70s and even into the 80s. And his son, Richard Christian Matheson, is also a great writer, but he wrote, I think Matheson wrote 4 episodes of The Twilight Zone.
Right.
And again, the script for this episode is great. And in 22 minutes, you watch these newlyweds, and by the end, you're like, is their marriage going to survive this? And it's really interesting how they sit on the same side. They sit right next to each other when they first come in. And then they're seated across from each other later when they come into the diner after they almost get hit by the car. And how, I love the message of the episode. It's like at the end when the wife says, are you going to choose are you going to be held in the thrall of your own superstitions? Or are you going to take your life and make it what you want, what we want? We can make our lives whatever we want them to be. And it's such a great message, that even though it's this creepy, weird episode, at the end, sort of love prevails and marriage prevails, and a strong bond between husband and wife and moving forward into the future is really what this episode is all about. So in a way, it's strangely life-affirming, until, of course, you see the results at the very end of what a bad marriage, where the couple can't grasp, and they're held in the thrall, which is a great, it's a quiet twist, but it's a devastating twist. Like when you see this poor couple, and when are we ever going to get out of this town? It looks like they've been there for months, if not years, And
it's truly one of the darkest endings to a Twilight Zone when you think about it. And we just dealt with the Howling Man with letting the devil out, and this is more dark than that, I guess. But for me, I won't bury the lead. I already have said several times on this podcast that I think this is the better of the 2 Shatner episodes. Now, Nightmare is a very good episode, but I just think this one hits a lot more for me. And the main reason is because I enjoy quiet character pieces. And Robert, as you mentioned, there's not much to this. They go into the diner, they leave the diner, they come back into the diner. But these 2 actors are doing such a great job carrying it. There's no makeup, there's no special effects. You've got a goofy-looking bobblehead devil on the table, and that's really about it. And they do such a good job of carrying it. And I won't bury the lead on it. I mean, it's one of my favorite Twilight Zone episodes of all time, so I've been looking forward to getting to this one. But everything you all said, I just ditto. I mean, I think the key theme here is, yes, his superstition is kind of hit over the head a little bit when he doesn't want her to break the handhold to go around the pole. He's got the rabbit's foot that he kisses when they leave the store and all that good stuff. But I think the discussion being had here is, how do you decide what will control your own destiny? Will it be you, or will it be outside factors? And I love the fact that there is that choice is made, and we see both options. We see if you decide to let the future be what it will, and you go off in your convertible to New York, and then you have the other couple who come in and look like they've been ragged for a while. And not only are they not allowed to leave because of their superstition and their fear, but they're not even allowed to ask the stupid thing questions half the time. The first question they ask is, can we ask you more questions now? Like, how long have they been waiting to be able to ask questions?
Right, like every day for a year? Well, that's, what's really interesting. Oh, I don't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, please, go right ahead.
Well, what I thought was really interesting, like, it also shows the wild diversity of the stories that Twilight Zone's telling. I mean, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet is a monster story, and there's not a lot of subtext to it. I mean, the fact is, this crazy guy is not as crazy as you might think he is, and he really is seeing monsters. But this is a story that has an incredible amount of subtext, and also in terms of its metaphor. I mean, there's a lot of metaphoric Twilight Zone stories, but the overarching metaphor of this, which you just beautifully stated, is how people can be trapped by their own superstitions or their own belief system, and that's what this episode is really all about. And it's sort of oblique. The meaning of it becomes, it doesn't hit the nail on the head. I mean, it does hit the nail on the head, but on the other hand, the larger meaning of the episode has so much more to it than just being trapped by your own superstitions. I mean, it can apply to politics, it can apply to countries, it can apply to civilizations. The rise and fall of civilizations, where civilizations were destroyed because of their superstitions. And I like the fact that this Twilight Zone episode is dealing with these big concepts in the confines of a diner. Mm-hmm. In the confines of a marriage, this quaint afternoon between two people that really can be the difference between life and death. And it's what the Twilight Zone does the best.
So I think we've hit on some of the things we like, for sure. Is there anything else you guys want to hit on that really stands out for you before we talk about things that may not have worked for us?
Well, I wanted to hit on the machine one more time, because you and I made fun of another machine prop last season that really doesn't work. That slot machine in the Fever.
When they roll it in on the cart into the hotel.
And you look at this in this episode, and it's so much simpler, but it just has it has much more of a fear factor to it than that awful slot machine. And so it's just amazing. It's just amazing what kind of a that it has a presence in the episode.
Well, and there's two scenes that kind of really do it. Rob already hit on one with the shadow. The other one I like is up until a certain point, Don is just kind of playing with it, bobbing its head. But then there's a scene where it zooms in on it, and it almost cocks its own head to look at him when he asks a question like, I've got you now. And it has its own character. It's amazing how that little goofy thing with the white painted teeth that aren't even painted on correctly it can able to pull that off, when you're right, so many other things can't.
And well, there's also the moment where Shatner takes the thing in his hand and turns it toward him, and you're like, it's like, to me, it was just this innocuous fortune-telling thing until Shatner tried to like turn his head, and I felt that was a moment where it's like, he did it. I mean, if there is this evil, malevolent force that had him, it was because Shatner reached out and touched this head, and it's like, don't you touch me, man. Don't you dare touch me.
Later on, he actually gives it a hug, too. He kind of sits down and leans on the table and wraps it in his arms. Like, he's going to take it with him. He's very much idolizing this little machine. It's great.
You know, another thing that struck me when I was watching this episode is that I've always thought that Stephen King, one of the things that made Stephen King popular is he took horror out of the mountains of Carpathia. You know, he with vampires, it was in the little town of Salem's Lot, or everything happened in Castle Rock, and Twilight Zone did the same sort of thing, where great horror was happening in the most innocuous of places. I mean, sure, the Howling Man takes place in a castle, you know, way up in the mountains, but this story is just in this Norman Rockwell. It's kind of like a small town, and Matthew Weiner and Mark Zicree kind of touched on this in their commentary for this episode. Matthew Weiner created Mad Men, but that this was the sort of end of one era of America and the beginning of the urbanization of America. Like, this still represented, you know, this diner could have been from the 40s or the 50s. You know, it was a simple, innocent time, aside from the fact that food was terrible. And the fact that this fortune-telling machine was sort of encroaching fear. It was something that was brought into that diner from the outside. And what was interesting is it had proliferated because it wasn't the only one. Like, there were these fortune-telling machines all around. There's one at the counter, you know, the diner counter, that William Shatner was like, I'm not going to touch that one because that's not our fortune-telling machine. I mean, they even talk about it. Well, how do we know we can get the same answers, you know? And there's all this weird stuff that's going on. And what's great is this isn't stuff that we're just imbuing the episode with. You know that Richard Matheson, who wrote the episode, he meant for all of these things to be there. We're not just reading this into the episode. This is very calculated on his part as a writer, especially if you know the other things that he had written. And I read something interesting that Richard Matheson said he had hoped the same actress, is it Patricia Breslin? The same actress, he wanted her to play Shatner's wife in Nightmare at 20,000 Feet.
Oh,
so it would have been essentially a sequel episode. When
he truly is the same character.
Right, he's absolutely the same character, and he wanted and if the wife would be the same, I mean, what a great thing. But it's a really, I mean, I really enjoy it for that. And the Twilight Zone does a lot of that stuff. Like, will the real Martian police stand up? Yep. Which is one of my favorite Twilight Zone episodes. Another great episode that takes place in a snowbound diner. But there's something about, you know, these diners being, it's Americana. You know, it's what's more American than a diner?
Yeah.
So what are some things that may have not worked for you guys in the episode? We'll go to Brandon first.
There's really not a whole lot. We hit on, it's the 60s idea of superstition that we see in this episode, really a whole lot, the four-leaf clovers and the rabbit's foot and everything. But really not a whole, I mean, the fact that Shatner says, retarded dates it a little bit at that one point in the episode, but really not really a whole lot. This is one of those episodes that really works on all levels to me.
I agree with you. I mean, there's, the problem with the Twilight Zone is the problem, I fear, or I sort of weep for the fact that young people, we get further and further away from, like, I didn't watch Nickelodeon when I was a kid because there was no Nickelodeon. I watched Twilight Zone and I watched The Outer Limits and I watched Star Trek, and I just felt that as a child, I was watching some very sophisticated work. And to me, when I was a kid, the Twilight Zone was the greatest thing ever because you never knew what you were going to get. It was like opening a present on Christmas morning every time you tuned in. And sometimes there were less interesting episodes for my 5-year-old brain, but these are things I watched my whole life, and the fact that they still have resonance. There's not much in this episode aside from the fact that it does take place in sort of Mayberry, RFD. The town is such a simple place, but again, they're passing through. They're from St. Louis, but they're going to New York, and something's going on. Like, what's happening? But it's still like, yes, small towns, they're a trap. That's why I never wanted to go to them. I'm from Seattle, and small towns still scare me.
Well, we're talking from Springfield and Lincoln, so I understand
Yeah, so-
completely. But Lincoln's got what, 15 people in it, Brandon?
16,000. We're
Okay.
not that.
Close enough.
Yeah, but how far are you guys away from big urban areas?
We're about an hour from St. Louis.
Yeah,
3
see,
hours from Chicago. So,
there
yeah.
you go.
Or I'm sorry,
half-
not St. Louis,
half-
St. Louis.
St. Louis.
Yeah.
That's what Shatner says in the episode. St.
Every
Louis.
time, St. Louis.
Yeah.
He's very
That's-
Canadian.
It's great.
Yeah.
It's great. But
Speaking
yeah,
of, go ahead, Brandon.
No, what I was going to say is I love watching pre-Kirk Shatner and the stuff to see, you know, because he's become so stylized to us now.
Right.
You know, there's the Shatner way of talking. There's the Shatner way of line readings and things like that. And it's really cool. I think around this time, Bailiff and the movie version of Judgment at Nuremberg,
Yeah.
which was just around this time, and you see him with all these power players like Spencer Tracy and Burt Lancaster and all these people in that movie, and he's so understated the whole time, and he's sort of this sort of rock that Spencer Tracy leans on the whole time as he's facing these moral dilemmas and everything, and it's just always cool to me to see Shatner, you know, pre-Kirk in this era when he's sort of this clean-cut all-American guy, and he really does these roles well.
yeah, he's really good in this episode. I mean, the funny thing is yeah, he did become very sort of stylized and larger than life. But you know, I honestly think, the great thing about when I was working with Shatner is I really only had one big directorial note for him, and Free Enterprise wouldn't have worked if he was that big over-the-top Shatner. And I said, look, I told him, I said, Bill, because everyone who works with him calls him Bill. I said, Bill, you know, people have to wonder whether you're totally serious or you're completely out of your mind. And the only way that's going to work is if you play it straight, if it's deadpan, if it's totally. And he's like, oh, I totally get that. And I feel that if you know what you're doing when you're working with him, because he doesn't suffer fools gladly, and if you have a dialogue with him, he's absolutely directable. You know, you just have to not be an idiot about it. And I think back then, like, you know, he's clearly delivering a great performance, and there's a great moment in the latter half of the episode where you wonder, like, is there merit? Like, is he going to go off the rails and cause their marriage to fall apart? You know, and then when he tries to comfort his wife and holds her and says, "Don't cry, you know, it's going to be okay." It's heartbreaking, and you really believe it. And Shatner is. I've always maintained that he is a great actor, and you really see that in this episode. He's incredibly believable, and especially because he starts the superstition is a bit of a madness. You know, he's slipping into sort of this madness, but he's able to realize at the end, like, yeah, I'm a little nuts. This is a little wacky. And he's able to pull himself out because his wife is such a pragmatist. But it's a great, I mean, you really wonder if their relationship's going to go off the rails, because today I feel like it would. They would make it much more histrionic and over the top.
Oh, yeah.
It's great to hear that kind of, you know, first person account of what it is like to direct him too, because, you know, I'm reading the first 50 years of Star Trek, which is the first book of the two. Is
Altman and Ed Gross wrote.
Yeah, it's a really good book. It's just really firsthand accounts, just strung together, and most of the conversations in there are how, especially in the latter part of TOS, Shatner went out of his way, according to everyone around him, to kind of control things, to make sure that no matter who the director, who the producer was, it was his character who got the limelight and everything else. So it's very interesting to hear from you that may be just the fact that folks just didn't know how to work with the guy.
Yeah, and you know, look, people forget, like with TOS, I mean, the show was always behind. It never got the ratings they wanted it to get. And after season 2, it was going to get canceled. You know, and Shatner, like if you read Cushman's books, you know, Shatner was a smart guy, but he was the star of the show. Mm-hmm. And if the show failed, it was going to be perceived as a fault, his failing. The rest of the cast would go on and get plenty of work, and he could never work again, you know. And And I think that there was an undue amount of pressure put on because people forget Star Trek, despite what they say about the special effects now, was an incredibly sophisticated show for the time. It was state of the art, and Lucille Ball was somebody who had it, made sure it happened, and it was a huge undertaking, and it was all on his shoulders. So, and it was Leonard Nimoy who became the breakout star. So how could that have felt?
Yeah.
So, but I think Shatner, again, coming from Stratford, being classically trained, and I think you see why he is who he is in this episode. So it's great.
And I'm absolutely, I'm so very happy that he got a resurgence in the past few decades too, where he has been able to do quite a bit of work from his work on TV, and also having a lot of film work too. That's been outside of Star Trek, been outside of sci-fi, and able to just kind of show how he can handle things. Because you're right, he is a very a great actor, and being a guy who grew up in the 80s, he is one of the first actors that I ever latched onto. So we all have our built-in connection to this guy just because he defines so much of our childhood. Whatever generation you're in, for the past 40, 50 years, he's defined childhoods. Ugh.
No, he really has, and working with him on Free Enterprise, I'm really proud of the performance he gives in the film. I just wish I could get it out on HD and my preferred cuts of it all. But yeah, and I think you're right, because whether you watched him in the Twilight Zone or Star Trek, and he was in all these other guest starred in various shows, and then even in the 70s and all the way, then there was T.J. Hooker and Rescue 911, and then of course he winds up in Columbo TV movies, or it's crazy. He was in all kinds of wacky stuff. The only movie that was ever made in Esperanto, which was made by the Leslie Stevens, I believe, who did Outer Limits. Did that film. And I think it was Leslie Stevens, or maybe I don't remember. But this episode, it's a quiet episode of the Twilight Zone, and it's not as histrionic, but it is a great Twilight Zone episode.
So let's go ahead and let's conclude our discussion on this episode with our rankings of it. But then also, when we're done with this, I do want to talk about some news that has been kind of trickling out for a little bit now, but definitely was announced today. And that is that CBS, through their All Access, which is where Star Trek Discovery is as well, is bringing back Twilight Zone. So we'll talk about that here in a minute. But first, let's go ahead and give our final impressions and our scores. For those of you who are just joining us, we give these episodes a ranking of 1 through 10, and the ranking is based on how it compares to other episodes in the Twilight Zone franchise. So a 5 would be an average episode of Twilight Zone, and probably one of the better episodes of TV in general. A 10 would be one of the best episodes of the Twilight Zone, and a 1 would be the Fever Bewitching Pool. So I have made it clear to Brandon too. He is not allowed. He's never seen it. He's not allowed to watch Bewitching Pool until we get there. And I think what I want to do is do a live commentary of him just watching that episode.
Man.
Oh man!
But we have 2 years to get there. So let's go ahead and go to Robert first. Where would you score Nick of Time on a 1 through 10?
I'll give it an 8. I think I'll give it an 8. Because it's an episode that doesn't have the whammy that people remember, but I think it's an episode full of quiet goodness. And it represents a different kind of a story that people will find memorable, as opposed to Eye of the Beholder or It's a Good Life, or Talking Tina. What is that doll? Living Doll.
The Living Doll is a creepy ass episode. But yeah. And for those playing the home game, Robert gave People Are Alike All Over 8.5. So he definitely likes his 8s and around that area.
Yeah.
Brandon, where are you at?
I was toying between a 9 and an 8, because this is a top tier episode, but it's not quite in that upper echelon, like Eye of the Beholder and and the Hitchhiker and Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, where I put my 10s. But I agree. I think this is around an 8, but it's so I'm going to stick with 8. But it just amazes me when I think about the last 3 episodes. When you look at Howling Man, Eye of the Beholder, and this, those are 3 incredible works of television that we have seen.
Oh, it was Eye of the Beholder that early, season 2?
Yeah, it was the last episode we did. It came up right before this one aired.
Yeah. It's Howling Man, Eye of the Beholder, and this, all 3 in a row.
Wow.
It's you have this gothic horror story with Howling Man, this wonderful social commentary with Eye of the Beholder, and shot in such an amazing cinematic way, and then you've got this very simple story, and all 3 of them really good and amazingly individual. And it just shows you how great of a show this was from the very beginning.
Well, and Eye of the Beholder has always been a show to me that was, what would the world be like if Nazis won World War II? Yeah. Because there's this totalitarian regime, and there's the Führer, and you have to be a perfect human, a perfect specimen, even though their idea of perfection is different from ours. And I mean, I always thought there's so much going on in that episode. And the main A story is incredible.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But the diversity of this is why the Twilight Zone is such a great shows, because look what you get with 3 different episodes, wildly different stories.
Well, and then in a few episodes later, and we're gonna bring it up a few episodes so it drops at Christmas time. You have Night of the Meek coming up pretty soon too. So just the different types of episodes going through. But Brandon, this has only happened twice before. In the 43 episodes we've done this, I'm scoring this episode higher. And a lot of it is my built-in bias. I am a very much a Shatner fan. I have always been. But also, this is exactly my kind of storytelling with, again, the simplicity, the characters working off of each other. And when I think Twilight Zone, I think Nick of Time and a few other episodes like it, like Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. So I'm giving it a 10. I think this is one of the best Twilight Zone episodes out there. I'm crazy.
Wow.
But that's what.
Well, no,
third 10. Third 10. So.
Yeah, sure.
But you know, there's like what, 157 episodes or something of Twilight Zone, and the ones people remember is like 10. There's 10, maybe 15.
Yeah.
And there's another 130 episodes or 140 episodes, and there's so many great episodes that people don't remember. Although I think that the fact that they've made miniatures of the fortune telling machine has elevated this episode into,
I think you're right. Yeah.
Into a more iconic status. Shatner and the fortune telling machine.
And this is one of the reasons why we're doing this podcast is I have seen these episodes, way too many times, but Brandon, for the most part, has seen these maybe once or twice at the most. So I'm enjoying having, a fresh look at these as we go along too. And I'm hoping that people are joining along and checking this out. And especially now, and here comes another segue. And we will do right at the end, Brandon. I'm not forgetting, I promise.
No problem.
A nice little segue is because the new Twilight Zone show is coming out, we can actually deal with hopefully having people find this for the first time and start watching it for the first time.
Oh, yeah.
So with that, the news that was kind of coming out earlier when CBS had a shareholder meeting was they were bringing back the Twilight Zone for CBS All Access. And I guess the deals had not been fully done yet, but now the reports coming out, I think Variety reported it first, is that all the deals have been made. So Twilight Zone is coming back for a 4th TV series, and it's being show ran by Jordan Peele, Simon Kinberg, and Marco Ramirez. And they don't have a time when it's going to be coming out yet, but it looks like it'll be coming out pretty soon because they're already working on it. So I kind of want to get your guys' feedback on what you think about that, the new show coming up. Robert, go ahead.
Well, again, this will be the third sequel or third reboot of the series. We had the mid-'80s revival, the Phil DeGuerre revival that I'm a huge fan of. up until Straczynski took over and they didn't have as much money. They had to fill out the syndication package. Then there was the early aughts revival of the Twilight Zone, where they did a sequel to It's a Good Life with Billy Mooney, and a lot of my friends wrote for that show. I think, again, I love the idea that the Twilight Zone, because I know Leonardo DiCaprio was going to be involved in a new film version of it. If you include the film version, that's a 4th incarnation. So this would actually be the fifth.
Yeah.
The 5th incarnation. So again, the Twilight Zone lives or dies by its writing. And I think Jordan Peele's Get Out was a great extended Twilight Zone episode. That would be a great modern Twilight Zone episode. But to me, when we have a show like Black Mirror, I don't know if you guys have watched Black Mirror, but Black Mirror is incredible. And the writing on that is so strong that you really need great writers to make Twilight Zone live up to its potential. And I wonder, I don't know if that kind of writing exists. We're in a renaissance of television right now. I mean, if you watch like Godless, which I just finished watching, that 7-part, Scott Frank, who is a Hollywood screenwriter, wrote and directed that, all 7 episodes. Incredible, just incredible. And we're seeing we're in the throes of whether it was Mad Men or Game of Thrones or The Sopranos or The Crown. I mean, there's so much great TV, but the Twilight Zone is a very special beast, so to speak. And I think that how good it's going to be really depends on the writing. And I think that we saw with the early aughts revival, it's not easy to do because people have a cliched idea of what a Twilight Zone story is. And I think Black Mirror, showing as an anthology show that's doing some incredible modern storytelling. I mean, I think Black Mirror is a better version of the Twilight Zone than the early aughts revival was. So it's going to take a lot to make it great.
I completely agree with you on that. The one nice thing about this is because it's going to be streaming, I'm assuming it won't have to be a full slate of a season of 22, 26 episodes.
Right.
So hopefully they can put some time into this and only do 8, 10, 12 episodes a season. But a couple pitfalls I hope they don't fall into is I don't think they need to do the remakes like the other ones have done. There was a remake of Monsters Are Due. I think it was in the 2000s series as well, too. Find some new stories. And I agree with you. Go out and find the best writers you can find and pay them to write scripts for the show and use every kind of bit of ability they have to put into this thing. So hopefully we get some really good quality stuff. And I think, and Jordan Peele, and actually no, it's Kinberg who said this, I believe, that, we're kind of in the Twilight Zone right now. So there's not a better time to kind of bring back the show to talk about issues going on today in a very different kind of way. And I agree with you. I like Black Mirror a lot. I've only just started watching the whole thing. But I'm hoping that this can be something that at least adds to the conversation. I don't think it's ever going to be anywhere near as good as the 60s show, but as long as it draws people to this idea of this anthology series, I'm looking forward to it. Brandon, what are you thinking?
A couple of hopes for me for the show is that, Jordan Peele is someone who's proved that he has this, he's got a singular vision, and we've seen that with things like Get Out, and so you've got to have someone in the vein of Rod Serling who has that unique vision. And I don't think Jordan Peele is someone who would necessarily want to run his show by committee. And hopefully since it's online, there won't be as much network interference or network notes, because we know that the early seasons of the original series, Serling didn't have much interference from CBS, and that's how a lot of the earlier seasons are top quality as compared to the last couple of years when he didn't have as much control. So I'm hoping that they'll allow him to write and hire the writers he wants to and get what he wants this show to be out there.
Well, another thing that I think that Jordan Peele will bring to it, I was a big fan of Key and Peele and their sketch comedy show, and they touched on concepts and they did storylines and they did sketches that, even though some of them were hilarious, they borderlined on Twilight Zone-esque concepts. And I think he's probably got a lot of those. I don't necessarily think they need a host. They had Forrest Whitaker was the host, and then there was a Twilight Zone ripoff show where even Sir Mix-a-Lot was the host. I think it was a UPN show. I forget what it was called. But Serling was such a singular being that he was the writer, creator, but then he was such a presence on the show that unless it's warranted, I don't know who could be that person. I don't know if there is such a person anymore.
We were kind of. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, it wouldn't bother me like in the 80s revival, which I quite enjoyed. And some of those episodes really hold up despite the fact that the visual effects, it was early, like Star Trek The Next Generation, they were doing all their visual effects on video and compositing them on video. The show looks terrible. It has, because they didn't go back to the negative to composite it, unfortunately. But when they went and got some of the great fantasy writers of the time, there's Stephen King stories in the 80s revival. There's Harlan Ellison stories in the 80s revival. And there was a lot of fantastic fantasists who came back and worked. And I hope that they go back and they look to novelists and they look to playwrights and they don't just get a stable of television writers and expect them to come up with Twilight Zone episodes, because I don't think that's going to work.
Completely agree with you on that. So let's go ahead and wrap this sucker up. First off, Brandon, go ahead and have us hear what Ron had to say at the end of the episode, and then we'll do our plugs.
Okay. Counterbalanced in the little town of Ridgeview, Ohio, enslaved by the tyranny of fear and superstition, facing the future with a kind of helpless dread. Two others facing the future with confidence, having escaped one of the darker places of the Twilight Zone.
So, Robert, tell folks where they can find you and what you're working on.
Well, you can find me twice a week on Collider Heroes, which is on the Collider YouTube channel for as long as that lasts. I hope it keeps going forever.
You guys have been going for a long time so far.
Yeah, I've been on it for over 2.5 years, which is crazy, which I love. It's a great show. We talk about comic book movies. And then I just worked on something that I'm really proud of that's kind of out of left field. It's called Crisis Medicine. And a friend of mine who's a former Green Beret and an ER doctor has been teaching a course to first responders, civilians, anybody who's interested who might find themselves in high-risk events, whether you're in an active violent event like the Las Vegas shooting or you're in a building collapse or whatever. This Crisis Medicine series, and you can find if you just Google Crisis Medicine, you can take the course, and I directed, produced, shot, and edited the series. And there's a 1-day course, a 3-day course, and a 5-day course. And it's a lecture series and scenarios where we get out and work with local law enforcement to shoot these scenarios. And then I'm also editing a movie now called Tango Shalom, which I've been working on for over a year, which is the greatest Jewish Hasidic spiritual quest dance comedy you didn't know you needed.
You brought this up the last time you were on too, and I'm still waiting to check this thing out.
Yeah, it's I've been working on it for a year and a half, and it's pretty good. And I want to finish it. We had, as many independent projects do, we've had fits and starts, but the film is edited, and I want to take it through the rest of post.
Sounds good. You can find us at thefrontrowmoviereviews.com. You can email us at thefrontrowmoviereviews@gmail.com. And please go to the website and check out the shows that we have going on. Brandon and I just did a classics episode with him about 12 Angry Men. We're doing a lot of Christmas stuff. I am extremely excited. We actually, I guess, are somewhat official here at the reviews because we got press passes to see Jumanji on Friday. And I'm going to go see hopefully not the abomination that is Jumanji. And once the embargo is lifted on that, I will do a review on that too. So it's exciting, some of the things that we're doing. And Robert, we do have our Star Trek Discovery podcast that airs Sunday nights after the episode drops, and you need to be on it.
I would love to be on it. I would love to be on it. By the way, I hear the Enterprise does show up, by the way.
Oh, in the mirror universe or in the real universe?
I've heard it. I just heard it shows up, and a friend of mine who I trust said the redesign is actually great.
Well, and even Trials and Tribulations, when they just CGI'd it, and obviously the remake, not the remake, the redo of the TOS that was released several years ago now, you can make that ship look good without having to change it.
In Trials and Tribulations, that was a model. Greg Jean built a beautiful. I've held it in my hand.
See, I didn't realize that. I figured they just doctored it up, but that's even better now.
It's better. It's huge. It's like 4 feet long.
Another reason why Deep Space Nine is still my favorite show. Okay.
Yeah, it's a great show.
But thank you so much, Robert, for coming on again. It's always a pleasure. You're great.
I love it, man. I love talking about Twilight Zone.
And we'll get you on whenever you want. And then, like I said, I will get you on to talk about Discovery because you and I need to rant a little bit.
Oh, yes.
It needs to be cathartic ranting is what we need. Okay.
Did you guys already do, is it Mirror Image, the bus station episode?
Yeah. That was season 1.
I'm strangely obsessed with that episode.
It's a really good episode.
Yeah. It's very creepy.
Yeah, a couple of the biggies we got coming up. Invaders, 22, Night of the Meek, Long Distance Call, which is a special place in my heart for that episode.
It's a good one.
And one of my favorites is coming up here sooner rather than later, and that's The Obsolete Man. So there's a lot of good ones coming up pretty soon.
I've always thought The Obsolete Man takes place in the same universe as Eye of the Beholder.
I can see that. A little bit before the nukes and after the nukes.
Yeah.
Well, we really do appreciate it, man. It's great to have you on again. We'll continue to do this and keep fighting the good fight wherever you're at. We appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you, sirs.
So until next time, I am Scott, and with me, as always, is
Brandon Davis.
And with us today has been
Robert Burnett, and it's been great.
And until next time, make sure to check out the chicken fried steak, and we will see you on the couch. Have a good night, folks, or a good day, or whatever the hell it is. Adios.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Zone-i-Sodes. Zone-i-Sodes is a special presentation of the Front Row Movie Reviews podcast. For more information, go to www.thefrontrowmoviereviews.com.